Thank you all for joining us. I'm really thrilled to be joined by Omer Bartov, who's the Samuel Pizar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. Omer, I wanted to ask you a question. I know you've been asked this before, and I should tell folks that, of course, they should put questions in the chat, some of which I'll convey to Professor Bartov. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your evolution in thinking on the question of Israel's attack on Gaza and whether it constitutes genocide, how you were thinking about that in the early days after October 7th, and then the evolution of your views as the war has now gone on for more than a year.
Sure. And I should just say that I just heard this morning that Amnesty International is about to issue a report speaking of genocide in Gaza. And I read just the gist of it. So my own thinking evolved in the following way. Last November, November 2023, in early November, I published an op-ed in the New York Times. And there I said that I thought there was good evidence that the IDF was committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, and that there had been genocidal statements by Israeli leaders, both political and military, but that there was no sufficient indication that genocide was actually taking place, and that one could think of those statements made at the time as statements made in the heat of the moment, immediately following the massacre by Hamas. By May 2024, particularly in connection to the Israeli decision to invade Rafah and to evacuate about 1 million people who were living there, mostly displaced, several times, due to orders by the IDF, and to move them to the Mawasi area, to the beach area, it appeared to me that it was no longer possible to deny that this was a genocidal operation, and that one had to look back and to see what the logic, what the method was of the entire operation. And when you looked back, you could see that these statements were not simply statements made in the heat of the moment, but were statements that actually had effect, not only in inciting the soldiers, which obviously they did, but also reflecting a particular technique that the IDF was implemented, which included systematic destruction of universities, of schools, of mosques, of museums, of other public buildings, as well as of housing and infrastructure, so that the removal of populations, which itself was very difficult for the population, was not so as to move them out of areas of military operation, but rather, as soon as they were evacuated from those areas were destroyed. And so what it meant was not only vast numbers of people killed, and we can talk about the figures, which are extremely high, but also destruction of any ability for Palestinians as a group to maintain their own cultural identity, because everything that constitutes that was being destroyed. Now, since then, since May, and May is an interesting moment because that's also the deadline for the ICC decision that, if you want, we can talk about later. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court issued his request for arrest warrants also that May. But since then, we have been seeing a particular aspect of that began this October, in early October, which was an implementation of a plan that was being sold in Israeli media by a particular retired general, Giora Eiland, who was talking about how do we empty the northern third of Gaza, north of the Netzarim corridor, entirely of its civilian population, through warning the population to leave, and then if it does not leave, depriving it entirely of any food or water. And this is what the IDF now is implementing. In fact, most of the population has been pushed out already, and Jabalia, the main refugee camp there, has been almost entirely destroyed. So we see that as a microcosm of a larger operation, which is clearly intended to make Gaza completely uninhabitable for the Palestinian population there, to squeeze it increasingly to the south, and then to say either the Palestinians will die there or somebody will take them in, but they will not be in the Gaza Strip, which will then be turned over to the military. The IDF has said it's there for sure throughout 2025, meaning until 2026. And the settlers are waiting already behind the corner to start moving in. And if they do, there won't be anybody around to remove them.
Yeah, and one of the points that Eyal Weitzman, who runs this group called Forensic Architecture, made to me when I interviewed him last week was also that the area of Gaza that the people are being forced to is the area with the least rain and the worst soil. So it's also the part of Gaza that is actually least habitable. I think there are a lot of people still who, when they hear the word genocide, think that means killing everybody or it means the Holocaust. Can you just talk a little bit about what genocide actually means as an idea in international law and how you judge whether something crosses that threshold?
So, yeah, the Genocide Convention is an interesting and kind of unique definition of genocide, but it's the only one that matters under international law, so we should take it seriously. And there are two aspects to it that are interesting. The first is that the Genocide Convention is, in many ways, a response to what happened in World War II, and in particularly to Nazi crimes, and most especially to the Holocaust. So the Holocaust played a role in the international community coming together and agreeing on something that it might not have agreed on 10 years later. It's also interesting that it's agreed on in 1948, the same year that the UN also decides to allow for the existence of a Jewish state. So these two things happen together. But the definition itself of genocide is not based on an analysis of what the Nazis did to the Jews. It's a very separate kind of idea. What the Genocide Convention says is that genocide is the intent to destroy a particular group. It could be a national group, ethnic group, religious group, in whole or in part, as such. So unlike other laws, such as crimes against humanity or war crimes, in order to prove that something is genocide, you have to show that there is an intention and then the implementation of that intention to destroy a group as a group. You're not killing people because you want to kill people. You're killing people or doing other things to them, such as taking away their children or sterilizing them, so as to destroy the ability of that group to exist as such, even if individuals of that group are left alive. In that sense, the question of numbers, how many people do you have to kill in order for that to be genocide, while it matters, is not the cardinal question. The question is whether there is an intent to destroy a group as a group. So you can think of such events, say, as what happened with the Aborigines in Australia, with First Nations in Canada. If you take away the children of a group, and you adopt them or you put them in orphanages usually, and you deprive them of their culture, you are in that sense destroying the group as a group, even if you leave the individuals alive. Now, if you apply that to the case of Gaza, 80% of the population of Gaza are Palestinians. They are refugees of 1948. People were kicked out of what became the State of Israel in 1948, or mostly their descendants. And they are a large proportion of the Palestinian people as a whole. There are over 2 million people. And the attempt to destroy their existence as a group, not simply by killing them, but by destroying everything that makes a group into a group. It's educational, religious, collective memory institutions, and to remove them from that territory can, in that sense, be construed as genocide.
By that definition, Omer, would the Nakba of 1948 also have been considered a genocide? Because regardless of how many people were killed, you had this mass expulsion, essentially the destruction of entire villages, of all of the kind of infrastructure that made up Palestinian society.
It's a very good question. About, I think, 15 years ago or so, I had an argument with another genocide scholar over that.
This has been a free preview of my weekly conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.